The morning of the September parade in the year 1945 it seemed routine for the British, American, and French officers who were watching the Soviet column move forward through the destroyed Berlin Avenue. But that routine broke at the exact moment when a metallic whistle, different from any T-34 or IS-2 tank they knew, began to echo between the burned buildings. The observers turned their heads almost at the same time. What was coming behind did not appear in any previous intelligence report. The Allies were about to see a battle tank that had not yet fought a single battle, but was already about to change their understanding of armored warfare. The first thing they saw was the shape of the front. It was not a straight plate or two common sloped armor pieces. It was a pointed wedge, a sharp bow formed by two sloped armor plates that came together at an extremely small angle, creating a figure that looked like the snout of a pikefish coming out of the water to attack. That shape had no precedent. The Soviet engineers, after studying remains of dozens of turrets that were pierced during the winter of the year 1944, had reached a simple and devastating conclusion. No flat armor, no matter how thick it was, could resist the German high-speed shells forever. The only real defense was to physically force the shell to slide off, lose energy, and deflect. That is how the famous Pike Nose of the IS-3 was born. The turret increased the shock. Instead of angles, welded plates, or vertical surfaces, the Soviets presented a cast dome made of one single piece, with continuous curves, without a single obvious weak point. For Western engineers, it was an almost unimaginable technical challenge. Casting such a large rounded piece required extraordinary metalworking technology and temperature control that only a few Soviet plants could afford. Years later, British experts would describe that turret as a shape designed to turn each hit into a mathematically unavoidable bounce. Even more disturbing was the cannon. The D-25T of 122 millimeters, with shells that weighed more than 25 kilograms, was not a weapon designed for rapid exchange of fire. It was a demolition tool. A direct hit, even without complete penetration, could tear off turrets, destroy internal structures, and vaporize armor. What was surprising for the Allies was seeing a weapon of such size mounted on a tank whose silhouette they did not recognize. That cannon traditionally belonged to heavy artillery, not to a battle tank that moved with a disturbing smoothness. The psychological impact was immediate. The British reports from that day record phrases that show the confusion. It does not look like anything produced during the war. The front is invulnerable to our standard shells. If this had entered combat before April, the offensives would have been different. The Americans, more practical, focused on the armor. The combination of the sharp angled bow, the rounded turret, and the extremely low profile of the hull made it almost impossible to find an easy point of impact. For the first time in the entire conflict, the Allies felt they were observing a tank designed to resist not only the present, but an unknown future. What none of them knew yet was that this tank had been born in a desperate situation. At the end of the year 1944, the Soviets understood that although the IS-2 was still fearsome, the new German high-speed cannons could penetrate it in specific circumstances. The margin of vulnerability was small, but enough for Stalin to demand an immediate qualitative leap. That is how Project Object 703 emerged, a tank that had to transmit a clear idea even without entering combat, a machine designed both to destroy and to intimidate, a symbol both political and military. Its development was a frantic race in Tancograd, where entire production lines were redesigned. Giant casting molds were created, and they experimented with new alloys. The rounded turret was not a whim. It was the result of mathematically solving how to make an enemy shell never find a safe point of impact. The wedge-shaped front was not about looks. It was the product of ballistic analysis based on thousands of data points extracted from destroyed hulls on the Vistula front in East Prussia. And yet the most surprising thing was what this monster had not done. It had not fired a single time. It had not participated in any offensive. It had not rolled through any battlefield. The IS-3 entered world history not with fire, but with presence. Its simple appearance in Berlin was enough to change the Western perception of what a Soviet heavy tank meant. In one single morning, without combat, without destruction, and without a single shell fired, the legend was born of the tank that terrified the world just with its shape. While the Western observers were trying to process what they had seen in Berlin, inside the Soviet Union, internal reports were already circulating that explained how that unique machine had emerged from an almost inhuman technical race. The IS-3 was not the result of a slow project or a classic development cycle. It was the direct consequence of a sequence of decisions made under the absolute pressure of the end of the year 1944, when the Soviet High Command demanded an armored vehicle that would anticipate any enemy advance even before it appeared on the battlefield. The real beginning started in the workshops of Tancograd, where the engineers studied the remains of armored vehicles recovered near the Vistula. Two certainties were born there that guided the design of the new tank. The first, the enemy used high-speed shells capable of piercing vertical steel plates even with generous thicknesses. The second, the solution was not to increase the thickness unlimitedly, but to modify the shape of the armor until each impact turned into a forced loss of energy. That is why the new hull not only had the famous Pike Nose, but its entire structure was made of carefully calculated slopes. The discussions inside the design office were intense. There were those who defended continuing with the line of the reinforced IS-2, while others pushed for a complete break from the previous design. The decisive argument came from the metallurgical engineers. Soviet casting technology had finally reached a point where they could produce rounded turrets made of one single piece. That possibility modified the entire concept of the vehicle. A turret without joints, without welding lines, and without exposed angles drastically reduced the risk of penetration. The rounded shape allowed an immediate dispersion of the kinetic energy of enemy shells. From that moment on, a race against time began. The first scale models were assembled in just a few weeks. Then came the improvised prototypes for static tests. Structures without engine, without transmission, just hulls meant to receive experimental impacts. The engineers placed metal masses that simulated enemy shells and launched them against the sloped surfaces. The results were conclusive. Even when the shell maintained all its energy, the angular deflection was so pronounced that the impact lost effectiveness before penetrating. But the armor was not the only concern. The transmission, a traditionally problematic point in Soviet heavy tanks, had to be completely redesigned. The specialists knew that a vehicle that exceeded 40 tons could not afford mechanical failures in situations of continuous advance. Therefore, a reinforced gearbox and an improved clutch that could withstand sudden load variations were installed. At the same time, a revised suspension was incorporated that combined torsion bars with interspersed rollers to distribute the weight evenly and maintain stability even on uneven terrain. While the technical teams worked day and night, the Defense Committee demanded that the new tank incorporate a weapon capable of neutralizing any existing armored vehicle. The 122mm cannon was a logical choice. Not only had it demonstrated its effectiveness in the IS-2, but it possessed a destructive power capable of disabling enemy turrets even without completely piercing them. The combination of that cannon with an almost impenetrable hull was the element that would transform the vehicle into a symbol of Soviet military supremacy. The first dynamic tests were carried out in secret in the surroundings of Magnitogorsk. Under temperatures that dropped below 20 degrees below zero, the prototypes traveled through snowy terrain, climbed icy slopes, and crossed artificial ditches. The preliminary reports highlighted the surprising smoothness of movement for a tank of its size. The engine, although demanding in maintenance, delivered the necessary power to maintain adequate speed in hostile conditions. However, not everything was immediate success. The first prototypes presented cracks in the turret due to irregular cooling during casting. This problem delayed production for weeks and forced them to modify the molds. Also, failures emerged in the internal electrical systems, which led to redesigning the wiring distribution and improving protection against short circuits. Each failure was recorded, analyzed, and corrected with unusual speed for an industrial process of that magnitude. By March of the year 1945, the tank was ready to be mass-produced. But then, a determining event occurred. The war in Europe was coming to its end. The final offensive against Berlin was advancing faster than predicted. When the first IS-3 tanks came off the assembly line, there were no longer any large battles to fight. The tank, for which a colossal amount of resources had been invested, would not have an opportunity to demonstrate its capability in combat. One last alternative remained: use it as a psychological tool. That is why the IS-3 was sent directly to the parade, not to celebrate a victory, but to send a clear message. The Soviet Union could produce a tank that surpassed everything that had existed until then. And although the West did not know it at that moment, that vehicle was only the first step of a new generation of armored vehicles that would completely transform global armored doctrine. While the IS-3 was beginning to establish itself as a symbol of Soviet military power, inside the general staff, a process of reflection was opening that would determine its future. The armored vehicle had been born to impress and project force, but its true role within the armored forces still required precise definitions. The transition from a technical concept to a real combat instrument implied a deep study of its capabilities, limitations, and the strategic environment that was emerging after the war. The first measures adopted by the Ministry of Defense consisted of establishing specific units intended for the use of heavy tanks. The IS-3 could not be integrated simply into traditional medium tank formations because its mass, its 122mm armament, and its sloped armor transformed any operation into a completely different scenario. Therefore, independent regiments of heavy tanks were formed, made up of specially trained crews and with their own logistics chain. During the summer of the year 1946, extensive maneuvers were organized in remote areas of the Soviet South. These tests included prolonged movements, firing exercises with moving targets, and nighttime routes. The reports highlighted that the vehicle, despite its weight, maintained remarkable stability on uneven terrain. The reinforced suspension with torsion bars responded effectively, allowing adequate precision even in slow movement. It was also observed that the engine, although requiring rigorous maintenance, offered enough power to cross ditches, slopes, and muddy surfaces without losing traction. The crews, on the other hand, shared concerns based on direct experience. The interior was cramped for the long training days, and handling the large shell required perfect coordination between loader and gunner. The reloading process, although manageable, involved intense physical effort that could affect performance during prolonged operations. Despite this, the crew agreed that the destructive power of the main weapon compensated for any internal difficulty. One of the most sensitive aspects was visibility. The turret, made of one single piece, designed to deflect impacts, generated a limited field of vision compared to lighter tanks. To improve this situation, new periscopes were installed, and the commander's cupola was modified, slightly increasing observation capability without compromising protection. Internal ventilation was also reinforced after the first tests revealed excessive temperatures inside during continuous exercises. The technological evolution of the armored vehicle intensified when the High Command received reports about the development of new anti-tank weapons in other countries. This forced them to evaluate the side resistance of the IS-3, since the frontal structure demonstrated exceptional solidity, but the flags showed vulnerabilities to new generation shaped charges. Internal tests revealed that some impacts could generate structural damage even without completely penetrating. As a result of these findings, additional reinforcements were designed for the sides, and the internal fuel arrangement was reconfigured, reducing fire risks. At the end of the year 1947, a private presentation was carried out for the Soviet High Command. In this demonstration, updated prototypes were used that included improvements in the transmission, adjustments in electrical protection, and modifications in the suspension. The observations from that meeting confirmed that the IS-3 was still one of the most robust armored vehicles in the world, but they also underlined the need to continue perfecting it to face emerging technologies. Meanwhile, in Western countries, concern was increasing.
Intelligence reports collected descriptions that pointed to the capability of the IS-3 to resist frontal impacts from heavy artillery, its low profile that made detection at long distances difficult, and the power of its cannon, capable of destroying light fortified structures with a single shot. For NATO strategists, the Soviet armored vehicle represented not only a powerful machine, but an indicator that armored doctrine in the East had entered a completely new phase. The IS-3, which had been born without participating in combat and had been presented to the world in a parade, was beginning to prepare for its true destiny. That destiny was not in Europe, but in distant scenarios where the terrain, climate, and enemy weapons would test each of its innovations and expose the real strengths and weaknesses of the tank that had captured global attention. When the IS-3 began to gradually integrate into Soviet regiments, the international scene was already shifting toward new focal points of tension. Europe was stabilizing under two opposing political blocs, but outside the continent, conflicts were emerging capable of testing the weapons of both powers. The IS-3, which until then had been a tool of deterrence, would soon be dragged into circumstances very different than those its designers had imagined. The transfer of several examples to Allied zones marked the beginning of this new phase. The Soviets sent a limited number of tanks to several countries that were seeking to strengthen their armored forces. The most significant choice was Egypt, a state that was in the midst of a military reorganization process and that, due to its strategic position, received considerable support from the Eastern Bloc. The arrival of the IS-3 tanks to Egyptian territory in the mid-1950s caused an immediate impact. For local officers, those armored vehicles represented a giant leap in firepower and protection. Egyptian crews received direct instruction from Soviet advisors for months.
This process included intensive practices in handling the 122mm cannon, simulations of attacks against fortified positions, and coordination training between armored units and mechanized infantry battalions. The biggest challenge, however, lay in maintenance. The IS-3 demanded rigorous technical attention, precise lubrication, replacement of specific parts, and strict control of engine temperature. In desert conditions, this factor became a daily difficulty. Despite these complications, Egypt incorporated the IS-3 as a key piece of its new armored structure. Its mere presence transmitted a feeling of power that was useful both in internal politics and in projection toward its neighbors. The region was marked by persistent tensions, and the growing rivalry with the State of Israel made it inevitable that any advanced weapon acquired by the Egyptians would be observed with attention throughout the Middle East. The decisive moment arrived when the Suez Crisis erupted, and later the Arab-Israeli conflict of the year 1967. The IS-3, which had never fought in Europe, would now find itself facing a very different type of enemy. Israeli forces had received medium tanks of Western design, equipped with high-speed cannons, and, more importantly, they had modern anti-tank weapons capable of piercing theoretically robust armor. The combination of superior mobility and precision at long distances tested any armored vehicle that lacked speed in taking positions. The first clashes revealed a complex panorama. In frontal combat, the Pike Nose continued to demonstrate its effectiveness, deflecting impacts that would have been devastating in vehicles of previous generations. The rounded turret also resisted solidly, even against shells designed to pierce thick armor. However, the conditions of the desert terrain favored lighter and faster tanks. The capability of the IS-3 to maneuver was compromised by its weight and by the constant mechanical problems derived from extreme heat. Israeli anti-tank weapons, many of them portable and designed to be operated by infantry, became a significant threat. Although the frontal armor resisted competently, the flanks of the vehicle showed weaknesses that had already been detected during Soviet tests. In close combat, several side impacts caused serious damage, localized fires, and in some cases, the complete disabling of the tank. The elevated position of the commander and the scarce side visibility added pressure on the crews. The lack of experience in rapid maneuvers became another critical element. The IS-3 had been conceived to operate in large, coordinated offensives, not for battles of extreme mobility. In the desert,
Egyptian columns suffered ambushes and supply cuts that drastically reduced their operational capability. Even so, when conditions were favorable, the IS-3 demonstrated its value. Its 122mm shots could destroy improvised fortifications, artillery positions, and enemy vehicles with undeniable effectiveness. The Egyptian experience revealed a reality that neither the Soviets nor Western analysts had considered in all its magnitude. The IS-3 was not an obsolete tank or a technical failure, but it belonged to a transition stage in which war was changing at an accelerated pace. Traditional armor was beginning to lose ground against new explosive warheads and shells with concentrated energies. Mobility was becoming as important as pure protection, and the ability to integrate advanced observation systems was beginning to mark the real difference between victory and defeat. After the battles, numerous examples were left abandoned in desert positions or withdrawn to military depots. Some were recovered and analyzed by foreign experts who sought to understand the internal structure of the armored vehicle. The conclusions agreed on one essential point. The IS-3 was a masterpiece from the end of World War II, but it had been thrown into a scenario for which none of its original characteristics had been designed. What would happen next would mark the last great transformation of the tank, an evolution destined to prolong its useful life and adapted to a world where technologies were advancing at a relentless speed. After the battles in the Middle East, the fate of the IS-3 entered a phase of deep transformation. The armored vehicle had demonstrated strength in direct confrontations, but it also exposed limitations that could not be ignored. From this experience, the Soviet command decided to undertake a modernization program that would extend the usefulness of the vehicle in a world where weapons development was advancing at an increasingly accelerated pace. The update process began at the end of the 1960s. The engineers made adjustments to the chassis, reinforced the sides of the armor, and redesigned the internal arrangement of the fuel tanks. The goal was to reduce vulnerability to shaped charge munitions, a type of weaponry increasingly frequent in armored forces and infantries around the planet. These modifications, carried out gradually, also included a renewed electrical system and the installation of more reliable communication equipment, which allowed more efficient coordination between units. The result of these efforts was a variant known as IS-3M. This updated version presented a slightly modified silhouette with additional protections and more resistant external elements. Mobility also improved thanks to the revision of the transmission and the optimization of the engine ventilation system. Although it did not transform the armored vehicle into a modern vehicle comparable to new-generation battle tanks, the set of improvements allowed it to remain active in territorial defense tasks and in strategic reserve functions. During this period, the IS-3M began to appear in training exercises, internal parades, and large-scale maneuvers within the Soviet Union. These maneuvers demonstrated that, despite its age, the armored vehicle preserved an imposing presence. In exercises designed to simulate ruptures of defensive lines or attacks against fortified positions, the 122mm cannon continued to show a power capable of opening breaches in reinforced structures. The robustness of its front also maintained its reputation as one of the most effective configurations for deflecting conventional shells. As the Soviet Union introduced more advanced tanks, like the models based on the T-55 design and later T-72, the IS-3 assumed a secondary but not irrelevant role. In several regions, especially in units stationed far from industrial centers, the modernized armored vehicle continued to be appreciated for its resistance and its ability to operate in adverse conditions. In areas where maintenance was complicated by the lack of modern parts, the simple and robust structure of the IS-3 was an advantage. Over the years, some examples were transferred to allied countries that sought to strengthen their armies at low cost. In these secondary destinations, the IS-3 found a new operational stage where it was used both in crew training and in static defensive functions. Training operations with live fire showed that even decades after its creation, the armored vehicle maintained considerable power in controlled scenarios. The capability of the cannon to destroy light vehicles, bunkers, and precarious fortifications made it a useful actor within certain defensive doctrines. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, additional tests were carried out aimed at evaluating the useful life of the armored vehicle. The engineers conducted studies on metal fatigue, inspections of the internal structures of the cast turret, and analysis of track system wear. These studies revealed that the rounded turret, a revolutionary innovation in its time, continued to offer exceptional integrity, even after years of use. The hull, for its part, showed wear at specific points, which led to implementing targeted reinforcements to prolong operability. In the last decades of its active life, the IS-3 began to appear in strategic zones where the simple presence of a heavy armored vehicle contributed to reinforcing security. Its silhouette, known by Western analysts since the 1945 parade, maintained the same deterrent effect. In regions where a visible demonstration of force was required, the arrival of an IS-3M continued to transmit a clear message about the available military capability. Some units remained deployed well into the final years of the 20th century. Over time, several of these machines were withdrawn from service and stored in large military vehicle parks. In these places, the armored vehicles were periodically reviewed to guarantee that they could be activated in case of emergency. In certain depots, entire rows of IS-3M tanks lined up under metal roofs, preserved from snow and dust, ready to be mobilized if an unexpected threat arose. The operational end of the armored vehicle came gradually. Technological advancement, the arrival of guided anti-tank missiles, and the proliferation of lighter and more versatile vehicles determined that the IS-3 no longer fully fit contemporary needs. However, before disappearing from inventories, it still performed one last significant role. In several internal scenarios of the Soviet Union, especially during periods of tension, the IS-3M was mobilized as a presence vehicle, patrolling extensive zones and reinforcing sensitive points. Its size, its armor, and its unmistakable silhouette continued to be enough to ensure territorial control in wide areas. The final image of many examples did not occur on a battlefield or in a solemn parade, but in silent rows of vehicles prepared to be activated at any moment. There, under metal structures and between columns of accumulated dust, the IS-3 awaited orders that would never arrive. And in that industrial silence, surrounded by younger machines but without the same symbolic weight, the armored vehicle that had terrified the world without firing a single shell remained ready to move once more if someone required it.